I saw the flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror, my heart hammering against my ribs as I pulled over to the side of the road. This wasn't supposed to happen. I knew I had done nothing wrong. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my palms slick with sweat as I glanced at the other car, a sleek black SUV that was now parked haphazardly a few feet ahead. The woman stepped out, her heels clicking against the asphalt, her expression a mix of righteous anger and forced distress. She clutched her purse like a weapon, storming toward the police officer who had barely stepped out of his cruiser. I knew exactly what she was about to do, and I knew how bad this could get if I didn't act fast. Minutes ago, everything had been normal. I was driving home after a long shift, exhausted but alert, keeping to my lane and the speed limit. The intersection had been quiet, only a few other cars around. Then, out of nowhere, she had come barreling through, ignoring the red light entirely. I had slammed on my brakes, but there was no avoiding it. Her SUV clipped the front of my car, sending a jolt through my entire body. I sat there stunned for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, while she wasted no time jumping out of her vehicle. The second our eyes met, I knew. I knew she wasn't going to take responsibility for what she had done. And I was right. I stayed in my car, watching as she put on the performance of a lifetime. She was already talking to the officer, waving her hands, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. I couldn't hear her exact words, but I could tell from the way she pointed toward me, her exaggerated expressions, that she was spinning the story to her advantage. It didn't take long before the officer turned toward my car and started walking over. I inhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay calm. I wasn't worried, because unlike her, I had proof. The officer tapped on my window, and I rolled it down, offering a neutral expression. "Sir, we have a report that you ran a red light and caused a collision," he said, his tone professional but firm. "The other driver claims you were driving recklessly." I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it, but I knew better than to make this worse. Instead, I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "Officer, I'd like to show you something before we continue this conversation." Without waiting for a response, I reached toward the dashboard, pressed a button, and pulled up the footage. Her face paled when she saw what I was doing. She took a step forward as if she could somehow stop me, but it was too late. I turned the screen toward the officer, playing the video in full view. The clear, indisputable footage showed everything: the red light she ignored, the reckless speed, the impact. There was no room for interpretation, no way for her to twist the truth now. I watched as her confidence shattered, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for an explanation. The officer watched the footage carefully, his expression unreadable, but I could see the shift in his stance. He turned back to her, his brows furrowed. "Ma'am, do you have an explanation for this?" he asked, his tone far less accommodating than before. She stammered, her fingers tightening around her purse. He must have tampered with the footage. This isn't right. I swear, he ran the light." Her voice rose in pitch, desperate now, but the evidence was ironclad. The officer wasn't buying it. He straightened, his gaze sharp. "Ma'am, I need you to step back. We're going to verify the footage, but from what I see here, this contradicts your statement." I leaned back in my seat, exhaling slowly. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I had the truth on my side. And something told me she wasn't going to back down that easily. She stood there frozen, her face a mixture of disbelief and desperation as she struggled to regain control of the situation. The officer's shift in demeanor was unmistakable, his skepticism now directed at her rather than me. Her perfect plan to play the victim was unraveling, and I could see the moment she realized that things weren't going her way. I remained silent, letting her dig her own grave. Her hands twitched at her sides, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for an excuse, a way to spin this in her favor. "Officer, you can't seriously believe that video. How do you know it wasn't edited?" He could have, he could have done something to it. People fake things all the time. Her voice had lost the controlled distress it carried before, now laced with frantic defensiveness. The officer didn't flinch. "Ma'am, this footage is time-stamped and matches the street cameras. We'll verify it, but based on what I'm seeing, it's clear you ran the red light." Her breath hitched, and for a split second, I saw a panic flicker in her eyes. This wasn't just about a minor accident anymore, this was about her being caught lying to law enforcement, fabricating a false statement, and trying to shift blame onto an innocent driver. She had walked into this confrontation with confidence, certain that her word alone would be enough to condemn me. Now, she was standing on shaky ground, her entire narrative crumbling before her eyes. She shook her head, a humorless laugh escaping her lips as she threw her arms up. "This is ridiculous. I don't have time for this. I was just trying to get home, and now I'm being treated like a criminal. Look at his car, it hit mine. How do you explain that?" She turned toward me, her glare sharp, but there was no power behind it anymore. It was the last feeble attempt of a cornered liar, desperate to redirect the blame. I met her gaze with calm indifference. "Your SUV clipped my front end because you ran the light," I said evenly. "The footage shows everything. The officer can confirm it." The officer nodded, flipping his notepad shut as he gestured toward her vehicle. "Ma'am, at this point, I'll need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance. We're documenting this as a violation on your part." The shift in power was absolute. Her entire demeanor changed in an instant. The feigned confidence melted away, replaced by a tight-lipped, barely contained fury as she rummaged through her designer bag, yanking out her documents and shoving them into the officer's hand. I could see the way her fingers trembled, not out of fear, but out of sheer rage that she wasn't getting her way. People like her weren't used to losing. They thrived on manipulation, on the assumption that they could talk their way out of any situation. But this wasn't a situation she could talk her way out of. The evidence was against her. The lie had failed. She turned back to me, eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable for a moment before she leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping so only I could hear her. "You think you're smart, don't you?" she hissed. "You don't know who you're messing with." A threat. Not an outright one, but a veiled warning meant to intimidate me, to make me second-guess myself. But I didn't flinch. I had dealt with people like her before, people who thought that money, status, or sheer arrogance made them untouchable. I gave her a slow, measured smile. "Neither do you." Her jaw clenched, and before she could say another word, the officer interrupted, stepping between us. "That's enough. We'll finalize the report, and you'll receive a citation for running the red light and causing the collision. If you need to dispute it, you can take it up with the court." I could see the moment she wanted to argue, to lash out, but there was nothing left for her to say. She had played her hand, and she had lost. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, snatching her documents back from the officer and storming toward her SUV. She yanked the door open, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed it shut so hard that I swore I felt the vibration through the pavement. For a moment, I thought she might drive off right then and there, but she didn't. She sat still, gripping the wheel, her expression unreadable through the tinted glass. I watched her, waiting, because something told me this wasn't over. The officer turned to me, his expression far calmer than it had been at the beginning of this ordeal. "You're free to go, sir. If she tries to dispute anything, you have the dashcam footage as evidence. I'll include it in my report." I nodded, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Appreciate it, officer." With that, I returned to my car, sliding into the driver's seat, but I didn't start the engine right away. I glanced at my rearview mirror again, my eyes locking onto the reflection of the woman sitting in her SUV. She wasn't moving. Just staring ahead, her knuckles white against the wheel. I knew that look. It wasn't regret. It wasn't even frustration about the accident. It was something deeper. Something personal. And as I pulled away from the curb, something in my gut told me that this wasn't the last I'd be seeing of her. She wasn't done yet. That I thought that would be the end of it. A standard case of an entitled driver getting caught in her own web of lies, a citation issued, a lesson learned. But I should have known better. People like her don't accept defeat, they treat it like an insult, a stain on their carefully curated existence. And this woman, whoever she was, had taken it personally. I didn't realize just how far she was willing to go until a few days later, when I started noticing things that didn't add up. At first, it was small. A car idling at the end of my street at odd hours, headlights dimmed but still visible in the darkness. I caught glimpses of it more than once, a sleek black SUV eerily similar to hers, but every time I looked directly at it, it would pull away, vanishing around the corner. Then, my mailbox, tampered with. Nothing obvious, nothing that screamed vandalism, but I knew where I placed my letters before work, and twice now, I had come home to find them scattered on the ground as if someone had rifled through them. I told myself I was being paranoid. That maybe I was overthinking it, seeing patterns where there were none. But the feeling lingered, a slow, creeping unease that settled in my gut and refused to leave. Then came the calls. The first one was just after midnight. I was half asleep when my phone buzzed on my nightstand, jolting me awake. Groggy, I reached for it, frowning at the unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something in the back of my mind told me to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear, muttering a tired, "Hello?" Silence. No background noise, no breathing, just an empty void on the other end. I pulled the phone away, glancing at the screen. The call was still connected. "Hello?" I tried again, my voice sharper now. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a low, distorted chuckle crackled through the speaker, followed by a voice barely above a whisper. "You should have just kept your mouth shut." The line went dead. I sat there, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every hair on my body stood on end. That voice, I knew it. Even through the distortion, through the electronic warping, I knew. It was her. It had to be. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked my security cameras, but there was nothing. No suspicious figures lurking outside, no cars slowing down near my house. I went to work, trying to brush it off as a prank, an intimidation tactic. But then it happened again. This time, I wasn't home. I had been at work for a few hours when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from my doorbell camera. I pulled up the live feed, expecting to see a package delivery or maybe a stray cat triggering the sensor. Instead, I saw her. She was standing on my porch, her designer coat wrapped tightly around her, blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. She wasn't knocking. Wasn't ringing the doorbell. She was just standing there, her hands neatly clasped in front of her, staring directly into the camera. It was unnerving, something about the way she held herself, so poised, so calculated, like she knew exactly what she was doing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she lifted one hand, pressing a single manicured finger against her lips in a slow, deliberate shush motion. And then she walked away. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, my grip tightening around my phone. She wasn't done with me. She hadn't moved on. If anything, this was just the beginning. That night, I called the police. They took my statement, reviewed the footage, and advised me to stay alert while they looked into it. But I could tell from the way they spoke that they didn't see it as a real threat. Just a woman with a grudge, maybe a little unstable, but not dangerous. I wanted to believe them. But I knew better. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of my door handle jiggling. I shot upright in bed, my heart slamming into my ribs as I reached for my phone. The noise stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt even worse. I held my breath, listening. Then, the creak of footsteps on my porch. I scrambled out of bed, moving toward the window as quietly as I could. Peering through the blinds, I could barely make out the shadowy figure standing just beyond my front door, unmoving. But I didn't need to see the face to know who it was. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher answered immediately, and I forced myself to stay calm as I explained the situation. "Stay on the line," she instructed. "Officers are on their way." I waited, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The figure stepped back, fading into the darkness. By the time the police arrived, she was gone. They took another report, reassured me that they would patrol the area, but I could see it in their faces, they thought I was overreacting. That she was just playing games. But this wasn't a game to me. This was personal. And I had a sinking feeling it was far from over. I barely slept after that night. Every creak in the house, every distant car passing on the street sent a jolt through my system, my body wired with the kind of tension that wouldn't fade. She had been on my porch, at my door, trying to get in. And the police had done nothing. A patrol car had rolled by once or twice, but I knew they didn't take it seriously. To them, it was just a scorned woman, angry about an accident, playing petty intimidation games. But I knew what she was doing. She was testing boundaries, seeing how far she could push before I broke. I wasn't going to break. The next morning, I went to a hardware store and bought new locks, security cameras, motion lights, anything that would give me the edge. If she wanted to mess with me, I'd make sure she knew I was watching, that every move she made was recorded. By the afternoon, I had reinforced my doors and windows, double-checked every blind spot in my camera system, and prepared myself for the next move. Because I knew there would be a next move. And I was right. That night, my phone buzzed with another motion alert just after 2 in the morning. My stomach tightened as I pulled up the feed, already knowing what I would see. She was back. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 men stood beside her, both dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoodies. They weren't knocking. They weren't trying to talk. One of them was crouched near my front door, tools in hand, while the other kept watch. She stood slightly behind them, arms crossed, her expression calm, patient. Like this was just another task on her list, something she had planned out carefully. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scrambled for my phone, dialing 911 so fast I almost dropped it. The dispatcher answered, but I didn't wait for pleasantries. "There are people trying to break into my house. Right now. Send someone, now." My voice was sharp, controlled, but my hands were shaking. The dispatcher asked for my address, details, told me to stay put. "Officers are on their way," she assured me. But I wasn't reassured. I looked back at the feed. The man at the door was working quickly, trying to force the lock. I hadn't armed my alarm system yet, I had planned to do it before bed, but now it was too late. My breathing was shallow, my muscles locked in place as I waited, watching. Then, suddenly, one of my motion lights snapped on. The man at the door jerked back, startled by the flood of brightness, and the one standing guard whipped his head toward it. She, however, barely flinched. Instead, she turned her head toward the camera, tilting it slightly, as if acknowledging me. A slow, eerie smile spread across her face. Then, with a single nod, she gestured to the men, and they backed away. Just like that. No panic, no rush, just a controlled retreat. The SUV was parked down the block, waiting for them, and as soon as they slipped inside, it rolled away, disappearing into the night. The police arrived minutes later, but of course, they were gone. I showed the officers the footage, explained everything, but their reactions were frustratingly predictable. No actual break-in occurred, one of them noted. Could have been an attempted burglary. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. That wasn't a random burglary, I said tightly. She's been harassing me for days. The calls, the porch visit, now this? This isn't a coincidence. The officers exchanged a glance, then one of them sighed. We can file a report, but unless there's direct evidence that she intended to harm you, it's tough to prove harassment. You might want to consider a restraining order. I almost laughed. A restraining order? Against a woman with the kind of confidence that let her stand in front of my house while two men tried to break in? She wasn't afraid of legal consequences. If anything, she knew exactly how to operate within the lines, pushing boundaries without fully crossing them. But I didn't argue. Arguing wouldn't get me anywhere. Instead, I nodded, let them finish their report, and watched as they drove away, leaving me standing in the cold, gripping my phone like a lifeline. I replayed the footage over and over, focusing on her face, that expression, the way she had looked into the camera like she was enjoying this. This wasn't random, wasn't just some act of anger. This was personal. She had lost control of the situation the day of the accident, and now she was trying to take it back, to remind me that she was the one pulling the strings. And if the police weren't going to stop her, then I had to find another way. Because I knew, without a doubt, that she would be back. And next time, she wouldn't leave empty-handed. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room, lights off, phone in hand, watching the security feed like a hawk. Every time a car passed, I tensed. Every small sound made my pulse spike. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was prepared. I had been playing defense this whole time, letting her make the moves, letting her dictate when and how she would push. That was over. If she wanted to play this game, I was going to end it. The next morning, I took every piece of evidence I had, every video, every call log, every still image from my security feed, and went straight to a lawyer. If the police weren't taking this seriously, then I was going to take it to someone who could make them listen. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman who barely looked up from her laptop as I explained, nodded along, then finally leaned back and steepled her fingers. She's careful, she admitted. She knows how to toe the line just enough to avoid real consequences. But she made a mistake. My heartbeat quickened. What mistake? She tapped at the screen, pulling up the footage of the two men attempting to break into my house. These guys? They're not professionals. They're hired help, probably people she paid to scare you. But there's a problem with that. She zoomed in on the SUV in the background. This vehicle? Registered to her name. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. She had been so careful, so controlled, but she had slipped. Maybe she thought she was untouchable, or maybe she was just reckless, but now I had something solid. The lawyer didn't waste time. Within hours a restraining order was filed, a formal legal complaint was pushed through, and suddenly, the police had no choice but to act. When they showed up at her door, she must have been blindsided. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it. The officers knocked, she opened the door with the same confident expression she had worn in my security footage, but when they handed her the papers, that expression cracked. I imagined the way her face must have twisted with fury, the way she probably argued, tried to charm or intimidate her way out of it. But it didn't matter. The evidence was there. The car. The hired men. The repeated harassment. She wasn't just an angry driver anymore, she was a criminal. But even then, I knew she wouldn't accept it. People like her never do. They convince themselves they're above consequences, that the world works for them, not against them. And I was right. Just days later, I got another call from an unknown number. This time, I didn't answer. But I didn't have to. The voicemail came through, and I played it on speaker, listening to the slow, deliberate breathing on the other end before the voice finally spoke. You think this is over? A quiet chuckle, the kind that made my skin crawl. You'll regret this. The message ended, and I stared at my phone, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. She was angry. Furious. But she was also desperate now. And desperate people make mistakes. The next day, the police knocked on my door. They had reviewed the new voicemail, and combined with the restraining order violation, they had enough. They arrested her at her home. And this time, there was no escape. No smooth-talking her way out of it. She was done. I wish I could say I felt relieved when it was all over, that I went back to my normal life like nothing had happened. But the truth is, people like her leave a mark. For weeks after her arrest, I still felt like I had to look over my shoulder, like she might somehow find a way back, claw her way out of the consequences and come after me again. But she didn't. The last I heard, she had taken a plea deal, a slap on the wrist compared to what she deserved, but enough to keep her away from me permanently. One night, months later, I sat in my car at a red light, my hands steady on the wheel. Another SUV pulled up beside me, black, sleek, the same make and model as hers. For a split second, my pulse spiked, old instincts kicking in, but when I turned my head, it was just some guy, staring at his phone, oblivious to me. I exhaled slowly, the tension fading. She was gone. And this time, she wasn't coming back.